every pack in that square wanted to be seen, and I was the only one on the block trying not to be. And the Alpha King paid a price that emptied half his treasury just to lift my veil anyway. I remember the silence after the number left his mouth. Not the auctioneer's silence, professional and greedy. The whole square's silence, 1,000 wolves realizing at once that something had gone very wrong with the ordinary order of things, because the strongest wolf alive did not bid on omegas at mating auctions, and he had just outbid 3 great houses for a scarred woman nobody else wanted at any price at all. But that is the very end of it, and a woman who tells you the end before she has earned it deserves to be turned off. Let me go back to the morning of the auction, and a veil I had sewn myself to make certain no one would ever want what was under it. I am Rosalind, and I have been scarred since I was 7 years old, the whole left side of my face and down my throat, from a fire that swept through my village in a single terrible night. I do not remember most of it clearly. Smoke, my mother's hands, a heat that felt like the inside of the world ending. But I remember very clearly what came after. Children stare. Adults look away too fast, which is worse. And in a world where an omega's worth is measured, at auctions like the one I am about to describe, chiefly by her face, I learned early that my face had already decided my worth for me, and decided it very low. I did not resent the auction system the way you might expect. I want to be honest about that. It is a brutal thing. Packs without means selling their unclaimed omegas into alliance and service, and I do not defend it. But I had lived under its shadow my whole life, the way you live under weather, and I had made my peace with the one mercy it offered someone like me. At an auction, a scarred face is rarely bid on at all. I would stand on the block, veiled, and no one would raise a hand for me, and I would be released back to the lowest bidder's obligation. Some minor household needing an extra pair of hands, gentle enough work, and I would go on with my quiet, unremarkable life exactly as I had planned it. I had been to 2 auctions already in my 23 years. Both times I went unclaimed, and both times I was grateful for it in a way that would sound strange to anyone who had not lived my particular life. I had a method. I stood very still. I kept my breathing even. I did not let my hands shake, because a trembling woman draws the eye, and the eye is the last thing I wanted drawn. Stillness, I had learned, is its own kind of invisibility. Every other girl on that block wanted desperately to be chosen, to catch some lord's favor and rise out of whatever hard circumstance had put her there. I wanted the opposite, and I had gotten very good at getting it. The morning of the 3rd auction, I sewed my veil myself, thick dark cloth, and I told myself the same thing I always told myself. Stand still. Breathe even. Be no one's choice. It had worked twice before. I had no reason to think this time would be different. I did not know the Alpha King attended these auctions at all. I would learn later that he never had, not once in the decade of his reign, that his presence that day was itself the first sign that something in the ordinary order of the world had already begun to come apart before I ever stepped onto the block. If you want to know why the strongest wolf alive broke a decade of his own habit to stand in a mating auction square, and what he actually paid to lift a veil no one else wanted to look under, then stay with me. Follow this one to the end. I had a story I told myself, standing on that block, about exactly how this day would go. I had told myself that story twice before and been right both times. I was wrong the 3rd time, and the way I was wrong changed everything. They called my name. My true name meant nothing to the bidders, only my lot number, but I have always thought of it as the moment my name was called, because it was the moment my whole life turned, and I stepped up onto the block, veiled, and stood very still, and waited for the silence that meant no one wanted to look further. The silence did not come the way I expected. It came differently, and worse, and then, impossibly, better than I had ever once imagined. King Varric of the Iron Territories stood at the edge of the square, where he had been standing since the auction began, apparently there only as a formality of rank, watching without particular interest as the more celebrated lots were bid over. I did not know, standing on that block with my eyes fixed on the middle distance the way I always fixed them, that his wolf had gone rigid the moment I was led out. I did not know that the great grey shadow beside him had begun, very slowly, to move toward the block before its master had consciously decided to let it. What I did notice, eventually, because it was impossible not to notice, was that the king himself had started walking. He crossed that square the way I have since learned he crosses every room that matters. Direct, unhurried, as though the distance between 2 points is simply a formality he intends to dispense with. He walked past 2 great houses already gesturing for the auctioneer's attention, past a rival king's envoy who had clearly come prepared to bid heavily on someone, and he stopped in front of my block, and he looked at me, veiled and still, the way no one had looked at me in 16 years. "Lift the veil," he said to the auctioneer, "my lord king. The lot is unclaimed. There has been no formal bid. Custom does not permit a viewing without." "Then I am bidding," Varric said, and named a sum that made the entire square go still in the particular way a room goes still when something has broken that was never supposed to be capable of breaking. It was more silver than the 3 finest lots of the day had drawn combined. It was, I learned afterward, more than half the crown's own discretionary treasury for the year. For a scarred, unclaimed omega no one else had raised a hand for. The square erupted into the low roar of 100 stunned conversations at once, and I stood on that block with my heart hammering so hard I thought the whole crowd must be able to hear it, and I understood, with a slow falling horror, that the one mercy my whole method had ever offered me had just been taken away by a man I had never met. They lifted my veil. I did not lift it myself. I could not make my hands do it, so an attendant did, and I stood exposed on that block, the whole ruined left side of my face and throat bared to a square full of the assembled packs of the north, and I watched King Varric's face when he finally saw what he had paid an impossible fortune to look at. He did not flinch. I want that understood clearly, because I had spent 16 years cataloguing the exact half-second flinch every stranger makes, the one they think they hide and never quite manage to. He did not make it. His face did something else entirely. Went pale, then rigid, then filled with an expression I could not read and had no name for. An expression that looked absurdly like recognition. "Where," he said, and his voice had gone rough, "did you get that scar?" "A fire," I said, because it was the only true answer I had, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. 16 years ago, in the border village of Ashwell. "I don't see what business it is of Ashwell," he said, and the word came out of him like something breaking. He reached into his coat with a hand that was, I would swear, not entirely steady, and drew out a small object wrapped in cloth and unwrapped it with the careful reverence of a man handling something he had carried a very long way. It was half of a small carved wooden bird, crudely made, a child's whittling scorched black along one broken edge, where it had clearly been split apart by fire. My whole body went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the autumn air. Because I had the other half. I had carried it, wrapped in cloth exactly like his, in the bottom of my own trunk, for 16 years, the last thing my father had ever carved for me before the fire took him, split in 2 by the same flames that took half my face, and I had never once, in 16 years, imagined that anyone else in the world might have kept the matching piece. That's mine, I said, and my careful stillness, the whole practiced architecture of it, came apart entirely. That's. Where did you get that? That's the other half of a bird my father made. It burned in the same fire that did this to my face. How do you have? Because I was there, King Varric said, and his composure, which I would learn later he had spent a decade building around himself like armor, cracked open in front of the whole watching square. I was there, Rosalind. I set the fire. The whole square had gone silent, and this time it was not for me. I did not faint. I want that recorded plainly, because everyone who has heard this story since assumes I must have, and I did not. I stood on that block with my scarred face bared to 100 watching wolves, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very cold, and I said, "Explain that." Now, in front of all of them, if you have to. I have waited 16 years to know why my father died and my face burned, and you are going to tell me here, he told me. In front of the whole square, with his voice shaking, the king of the Iron Territories confessed a thing no king confesses in public. I was 17, he said, a young war captain, arrogant with my own first command, sent to secure the border at Ashwell against a raiding party that never actually existed. Bad intelligence, and I was too proud and too green to question it properly before I acted. I ordered a controlled burn along the tree line to deny the raiders cover. There was no wind that night when I gave the order. There was wind an hour later, and by the time anyone told me, the fire had already jumped the line into the village itself. His hands, holding the half of the wooden bird, were shaking openly now. I have carried that half of that bird for 16 years. I pulled it from the ash myself, the morning after, while the healers worked on the survivors, because it was the only whole thing I found in a street of ruin, and I could not make myself put it down. I searched for years for the family it belonged to. Ashwell scattered after the fire. No records, no trail. Half its people dead, and the rest gone to a dozen different villages under new names, trying to outrun what happened to them. I never found you. I told myself, eventually, that I never would, and I kept the bird anyway, because it was the only penance I had left to pay. I stood on that block and looked at the man who had, without ever meaning to, taken my father and half my face, and I felt everything in me that had gone quiet and cold from a lifetime of being unseen suddenly, violently, want to be seen after all, furiously, completely, on my own terms and no one else's. You bid on me out of guilt, I said, and it came out flat and hard. You saw the scar, and you recognized it, and you bought me the way a man pays off an old debt. That is not the same thing as wanting me, your grace, and I would rather stand unclaimed on this block for the rest of my life than be someone's walking apology. That is what I thought too, Varric said, quietly, for the length of exactly one breath. And then my wolf moved toward this block before I had decided anything. The moment you were led out, veiled, before either of us had said a single word, before I had any earthly reason yet to feel guilt, because I did not yet know who you were. My wolf did not recognize a debt, Rosalind. It recognized you. The guilt came a full minute later when I saw the scar and understood what I had done. The wanting came first. That was the moment my flat resignation cracked, and something furious and alive stood up in its place. Prove it, I said, because I have spent 16 years being the girl nobody wants to look at twice, and I am not going to spend the rest of my life as the girl a guilty king feels obligated to want. If your wolf knew me before your guilt did, then you can say so somewhere that isn't convenient for a man trying to make amends in front of a crowd that's already decided you're being noble. If you want to know whether he managed that, whether a king court, in front of the whole assembled North, doing something he could not yet explain even to himself, ever separated the guilt from the truth cleanly enough for either of us to trust it, then stay with me a while longer. I did not trust it for some time either. I had good reason not to. He took me from that square, not to his fortress, but, at my own insistence, to a modest house of his own, choosing at the edge of the capital, with my own staff and my own door I could lock. Because I told him plainly that I would not be moved into a king's bed on the strength of one confession and a matching bird. However true either one might be, he agreed to it without argument, which surprised me more than almost anything else that day. A man paying off guilt wants the debt closed quickly. A man who agreed to wait, and to be doubted, and to prove himself slowly over weeks instead of demanding I simply believe him, that was a different thing entirely, and I noticed it, even furious as I was. He came to that house nearly every evening, not to press his case, to talk the way I imagine two people talk who are trying to become something neither guilt nor a crown had any part in building. He told me about Ashwell as he remembered it, the parts I had been too young or too injured to recall, and I told him about the years after, the households I had moved through, the 2 auctions I had survived by disappearing into stillness, the particular arithmetic of a scarred Omega's life that he had never once had to learn. He listened the way I had learned over 16 years that almost no one listens, without flinching, without pity in his face. Only a steady, careful attention that felt, after everything, like being looked at properly for the first time. His wolf came too, every evening, and it did the thing I could not argue with no matter how hard I tried to stay guarded. It did not behave like an animal accompanying a guilty man on his rounds of penance. It behaved like a wolf who had found something it had been looking for a very long time and simply wanted, every single evening, to lie down near it. It brought me things, not fine gifts, nothing so simple as jewelry, which I would have refused on principle. It brought me small, oddly touching things, a good stone from the fortress grounds, a bit of soft fur it had clearly torn from its own bedding, once a whole fresh-caught fish deposited with enormous solemn ceremony on my doorstep, which made me laugh for the first time in longer than I could remember, and which I think Varick noticed more than he let on, because he came the next evening looking, for the first time, cautiously hopeful. Lord Draven made his move around the 3rd week, and I understood at once what he wanted, because I had been warned about men exactly like him my whole scarred life. He was a minor lord with an unpleasant reputation for collecting rare and damaged things. I had heard whispered stories, before the auction, of the sort of buyer who prized a scarred Omega precisely for the scar, for the particular cruel prestige of owning something broken and making it perform gratitude. He had, I would learn, come to the auction that day specifically to bid on me, expecting an easy, cheap acquisition, and had watched the king's fortunes sweep the prize out from under him at the last moment. He had not forgiven the loss. He came to my house one afternoon while Varick was away at council, all smooth courtesy, and he did not threaten me outright. Clever men rarely do. You must feel dreadfully uncertain of your position, my dear, he said, examining my modest sitting room with the particular contempt of a man used to finer things. A king's guilt is a fickle foundation to build a whole future on. Guilt fades, once the debt feels sufficiently paid. And when it fades, when he has proven to himself and his court that he is a generous, remorseful man, what is left for you? Precisely, a scarred woman with no bloodline, quietly set aside once the performance of penance has run its course. His voice was warm, reasonable, ruinous. I, at least, would want you for exactly what you are, with no debt to discharge and no performance required. Think on it. Kings tire of their apologies far faster than lesser men tire of what they actually desire. He left me with that, and it did precisely the work he intended, because it named the exact fear I had been carrying since the block, dressed up in a stranger's mouth instead of my own. But I had watched Varick's wolf choose me a dozen evenings running, long past the point where guilt alone should have satisfied itself. And I had watched the man himself grow quieter and more unguarded around me with every visit. Not more distant, the way a discharged debt would make him. And I understood, turning Lord Draven's warning over that night, that a man collecting damaged things for their damage was describing his own hunger, not the truth of what was happening in my modest little house. I asked Varick directly, the next evening, the question I had been circling for 3 weeks. If your guilt were paid, I said, if Ashwell had never happened, if you had never lit that fire, if you had simply met me at some ordinary gathering with an ordinary unscarred face, would your wolf still have moved toward me the way it did on that block? He did not answer quickly. I had come by then to trust the pause more than a fast answer, because I had watched him weigh every important thing he said to me since the auction, the way a man weighs something he has learned the cost of saying carelessly. I have asked myself precisely that question every night since, he said finally. And I believe the honest answer is that I will never fully know. Because the two things happened in the same instant, and I cannot unbraid them cleanly even in my own memory. But I know this. My wolf moved before I recognized the scar, before guilt had a single second to explain anything to either of us. Whatever it recognized in that first heartbeat, it recognized in you, entirely, not in the debt I owe you. The guilt is real, Rosalind, and I will spend years earning my way out from under it, and never fully manage it. But it is not the reason I have come to your door every single evening for 3 weeks, with nothing to gain from it but your company. A discharged debt does not make a man hope, the way I have found myself hoping, that you will finally believe him. That was the moment I stopped needing him to separate the two things cleanly, and something settled in me instead. Not certainty exactly, but a willingness, finally, to stop demanding proof a heart cannot actually produce on command. Lord Draven, denied by patience what he could not win by warning, tried once more. And this time, he tried to take by force what guilt and courtship had both failed to deliver him. He came to my house at night, with 2 hired men, while Varick's usual evening visit had been delayed by council business, believing, correctly, that this was the one gap in my protection he was likely to get. I heard the door before I heard them speak, and I had, by 3 weeks of living beside a king's wolf every evening, learned enough of its habits to know precisely what its low, warning growl from the garden meant before the men ever reached my sitting room. I did not wait to be rescued. I have spent my whole life being the one who does not wait, for the flinch to pass, for the veil to be lifted by someone else's hand, for permission to matter. I took the fire iron from my own hearth, because I have never once in my scarred life had the luxury of being defenseless. And when Draven's man came through my door, I met him with it, and I made enough noise doing so that the wolf, already straining at the garden gate, tore it half off its hinges getting to me. The wolf did the rest. Varick arrived in the wreckage of it, breathless, having run the whole way from the council hall the instant his beast's alarm reached him through the bond, and found Lord Draven's men already down, and his own wolf standing over me, and me standing over the iron I had used rather than the frightened, huddled thing Draven had clearly expected to find. Draven was taken to answer for it before the full court, and stripped of what standing he had, and exiled from the territory under a writ naming him plainly for what he was, a collector who had mistaken a scarred woman's stillness for helplessness, and paid for the mistake in front of every lord who had once been half inclined to indulge his reputation quietly. Varick knelt beside me in the wreckage of my own front door, and did not go first to the healers, though his hands were shaking. He took my face in them instead, the scarred side first, deliberately, the way no one in 16 years had ever once touched it without hesitation. "I have spent 3 weeks trying to prove to you that the wanting came before the guilt," he said, "and I understand now that I cannot prove a thing like that with words alone, because a heart does not carry receipts. So I am simply going to say it plainly, in front of my own wolf and your broken door and whatever is left of my dignity after running through the capital like a madman. I love you, Rosalind, not as a debt discharged, not as a fire repaid. I love the woman who stood on that block still and unafraid when every instinct in her must have been screaming to disappear. And I loved her before I ever recognized the scar, and I will go on loving her long after the guilt has finally, properly, been laid down. Stay, not as my penance, as my mate, which my wolf has known you were since before either of us understood why. I sat in the ruin of my own doorway with a king's hands on my scarred face and a fire iron still gripped in my own, and I did the only thing I have ever known how to do, which is tell the truth. I stood still on that block because I stopped hoping to be found a long time ago, I said, and my voice, for once, did not come out flat. Stillness was the only kind of safety I ever managed to build for myself. You broke it in one afternoon, and I have spent 3 weeks furious with you for it, and 3 weeks slowly discovering that being found again does not actually feel like the danger I always assumed it would. I let him see me, really see me, unveiled, unguarded, on purpose this time instead of by an attendant's hand. So yes, I believe you. Not because you've proven the guilt and the wanting apart perfectly, because I don't think anyone ever could. Because you kept coming back for 3 weeks with nothing to gain from it, and that's not what a debt does. That's what love does when it doesn't know how else to say so. He kissed me then, in the wreckage of that doorway, one breath, no more. A kiss that said a whole sentence and did not need to become a scene. And what broke open in me was not the thing the songs promise. It was recognition, plain and total. The vertigo of being wanted, finally, by the one person whose looking had never once, in 3 weeks, needed to flinch. The wolf pushed its great head between us, insufferably satisfied, and I put my free hand on its skull and understood that whatever guilt had first sent it looking for a fire it could never undo. It had found, instead, exactly what it always would have recognized on its own. A year on, I am the Luna of the Iron Territories, which still strikes me as a fortune too large for the modest life I once planned around my own stillness. I keep both halves of the wooden bird now, mine and his, joined with a thin band of silver where the fire split them, on a shelf where the light finds it every morning. Varric looks at it more than I do. I think it is the one object in his life that holds, honestly, the whole of what happened, the worst thing he ever did, and the best thing that ever came of surviving it, side by side, mended but never pretending the break did not happen. The scarred side of my face is still scarred. I want to be plain about that, because I have had women write to me since, hoping the story ends with some healer's miracle smoothing it all away, and it does not, and I would not want it to. Varric touches it now, the way he touched it that night at my ruined door, deliberately, without hesitation, as though it is simply part of the face he loves, rather than a flaw he is generously overlooking. I have stopped, slowly, cataloguing whether a new stranger's glance is a flinch or merely a look. Most days now, I do not need to check. A letter came last week from a household in the scattered remnant of old Ashwell, one of the families that fled after the fire and never returned, writing to ask, cautiously, whether the new Luna of the Iron Territories might be the same girl who vanished from their village 16 years ago, and whether she would consent to see them. If so, to speak of the ones who did not survive that night. I answered it myself, though my hand still shakes on hard letters. I told them yes. I told them I would want, more than almost anything, to sit with them and say the names of the dead out loud together. Because a fire that scarred so many of us should not be a thing any of us carries entirely alone. Varric found me sealing that letter at his own table, in the seat at his right hand, the two halves of the wooden bird catching the morning light on the shelf above us. "What are you telling them?" he asked. "The truth," I said, "that every girl at that auction wanted to be seen, and I was the only one trying not to be, and the one man who looked past every veil in that square anyway turned out to be carrying the other half of the only whole thing that survived the worst night of my life." I touched the joined bird, silver bright where the crack had been mended. I stopped hoping to be found. He never stopped looking. I suppose that's the whole of it. So before I let you go, tell me what you think, because I have turned it over for a year and I still cannot settle it fully. And I am not certain either of us ever will. Do you believe his wolf truly recognized me, whole and separate from the guilt, in that first heartbeat before he ever saw the scar? Or do you think the guilt and the wanting were always one single thing in him, inseparable, and that is simply what love looks like when it grows out of the worst thing a person ever did? Tell me your theory below. I have decided, in the end, that I do not need the answer to be simple to trust that it is true. And if you want to stay with us, the letter to Ashwell, the mended bird on its shelf, whatever piece of the past still finds its way back to our door, comment the wolf and follow along. Because I spent 16 years believing stillness was the safest thing I could offer the world. And I have learned, slowly, that being found is safer still. Where are you listening from tonight? Come sit by the window. The light finds the mended places best in the morning, and I have found, since the auction, that I do not mind being looked at anymore.